In this video newsletter, we will explore the question, what would you do differently if you were me? Hello, this is Tom Wakechild. How often have you heard someone say, if I were you, they would have acted differently? You have probably said it yourself. But is that really true? For example, if I was your boss and I ordered you to perform some action that went against your inner values, would you do it because it was your job? It is easy to say that you would not betray your own inner values in some theoretical situation, but can you do it in real life? Do you have the internal integrity to stand against that authority figure? Before you answer that, here is an interesting psychological study that was done in the 1960s and 70s that helps shed some light on how adults actually respond in what they perceive to be real-life situations. In the 1960s, Stanley Milgram, a famous and sometimes considered infamous experimental psychologist, devised an experiment that would explore the willingness of individuals to follow the orders of authorities when those orders conflicted with the individual's own moral judgments. These experiments were referred to as the Stanley Milgram obedience studies. Here's how the experiment worked. A test subject, who we will call the teacher, was to control a machine that would administer an electric shock to the learner whenever the learner failed to correctly answer a given question. The teacher was told that the research project was designed to determine the possible beneficial effects of utilizing electric shocks as an aid in the learning process. Before the actual learning tests began, the teacher was wired to the device and received a mild shock so that the teacher would know the device was working. There were two other participants in this experiment. One was the research scientist that assumed the role of the authority figure. The other was the learner. The learner was actually a fellow researcher that was playing the role of the one being tested and wired to the electrical shocking device. The learner's verbal response was pre-recorded and thus the same throughout these experiments. He was not visible to the teacher, but the booth was wired for sound so that the teacher could hear the pre-recorded responses and even the learners pounding on the wall begging for the experiment to end. At first, the shocks were mild, but with each wrong answer, the intensity of the shocks would be increased. The test machine clearly labeled the strength of the shock that was being administered to the learner. The control panel even provided warnings that at certain levels, the strength of the shock could actually result in death. With each wrong answer, the fictitious electric shocks intensified in strength. The learner's response also intensified from a mild initial response to cries of pain and finally pleas for the experiment to end because it was causing the learner so much pain. When the warning labels were ignored, eventually the cries of pain ceased, leading the teacher to believe that the experiment had resulted in the death of the learner. Throughout the experiment, the research scientist was in the room, and each time an incorrect answer was given, the authority figure told the teacher to administer the intensifying shock. The authority figure told the test subject, the teacher, that the researcher was taking all the responsibility for the project and that it was the teacher's duty to do their job and to proceed with the experiment. The actual goal of the experiment was to pit obedience to authority against one's refusal to participate in an obvious immoral act. How many of the teachers would blindly follow orders even when it could eventually result in the death of the learner? You would hope the answer would be none. But since there are some sadists in the world, perhaps 1 in 100 or maybe 1,000 might be willing to do so and go all the way. Milgram was shocked by the result. In the first test using 40 Yale University undergraduate students, 25 of the 40 administered what they believed to be potentially lethal shocks to the supposed learner. Perhaps the reason for 5 out of 8 going all the way was because the test subjects were Yale College students who had a high desire to please, or some other excuse for their seemingly immoral behavior. Yet, when Milgram's experiment was repeated elsewhere, the subject populations were even more likely to follow authority. On average, 2 of every 3 people tested went all the way. Milgram summed up the study by remarking that the fundamental lesson learned from the study was that ordinary people, simply doing their job without any malice on their part, can become agents in a terrible destructive project. Although one believes that they would never participate in a project like the Nazi death camps, relatively few people actually have the internal resources to resist authority. We tend to abdicate personal responsibility for our actions and morals whenever some authority figure is willing to accept that responsibility in our place. Few have a thought system that is willing to accept responsibility for living authentically with their self-proclaimed values. We are quick to judge others and claim that if we were them, we would have done something different. This experiment leads one to seriously doubt such a claim. If your self-identity has been determined by outside forces, your willingness to stand for your internal principles will be weak in the face of authority. After all, you have been programmed to believe your worth is determined by others who you perceive to be in authority over your identity. The results of Milgram's study is well known in the advertising community and has profound implications on how susceptible the individual is to external pressure. Yet most people are unaware of their mind's susceptibility to outside influences. This and other psychological research is being used to control the individual's ability to freely decide for themselves what principles will guide their lives. Society tells us what roles we are to play, and we blindly comply. In our youth, judgmental labels are placed on all things and thus become the governing criteria for our lives. Our self-worth is predetermined by outside forces that judge, reward, and punish. We are taught what to think, not how to think freely for ourselves. But you can free yourself from this harmful indoctrination. The good news is that some did not buckle under to those outside pressures and chose to live authentically with their internal values and morals. More likely than not, they too were the products of society's fear-based thought system, yet they found a way to resist. Follow-up research showed that those who remained true to their own values shared a strong internal focus. Their worth was self-determined. They knew they alone were responsible for their own self-identity and were determined to live their truth no matter what the consequences. They had developed a thought system that was able to withstand those outside pressures to conform. In a more recent study that was published in March of 2017 that included both men and women, the results of the Milgram study was once again duplicated. Things have not changed for the better. The bad news is that we live in a high-tech world in which manipulation of the individual is easier, more pervasive, and insidious than ever before. Individual indoctrination and brainwashing has been raised to a level of high-tech science. Your fears are stoked and false desires generated. Computer algorithms are specifically designed to make the individual believe that they are freely deciding to select an already predetermined answer established by the powers to be. The good news is that when you realize how vulnerable your mind is to outside manipulation, you can at least become consciously aware of some of these outside influences. You can guard your own values and protect your own identity. The truth is that if I were you with your background, your beliefs, your indoctrination, your fears, and your past experiences, I would react in the same way as you did. Why? Because everyone is always acting as rationally as their current level of fear will allow. Coming from that same identical background, I would have responded similarly because that was the most logical way in that moment to reduce my level of fear. Just remember that as a continuous learner, with each new experience, you gain additional feedback, learn new skills and responses so that tomorrow you can respond differently than what you did today. Although today, based on Milgram's study, I might choose to go all the way, tomorrow I can decide to follow my own internal guide and take full responsibility for my actions and say, I quit. So what would you do if you were me? This is Tom Wakechild. Create a great day for yourself and your world.